New old religions? Neo-paganism. Part 1. Religion as revival. One of the more peculiar facets of modern culture, especially modern secular culture, is a fascination with new things. We want our fashions to be trendy, our sciences and technologies to be cutting edge, and our mythologies, our arts and literatures, to be original. But we're the odd ones here. Most people in most cultures, and in most times, are much more likely to value something because it's old, rather than because it's new. As you may have noticed in our little tour of the world's religions, there's often something past-oriented about them. When we think about religion, we often think about old things. The creation of the world, ancient times, long-dead people, tradition. Thinking about religion is much more likely to make us think about the past than the future. And on top of that, many of the religions that we've met here have framed themselves as a kind of revival. Literally, a bringing back to life of something that people have forgotten about or ignored. When Confucius made his call to practice proper Li, the rituals, decorum, customs, and etiquette that are supposed to foster virtue and humaneness in us, Confucius presented it as a return to the past. Confucius didn't introduce the Li, he reintroduced it. And in the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna gave his teachings, his yoga, to Arjuna, he mentioned repeatedly that this was all once known to the ancient sages that he, Krishna, had spoken to ages ago in previous lives. And when Jesus and the authors of the Gospels appeared on the scene, they explained that what Jesus was doing and what Jesus himself was something very ancient. Jesus was there in the beginning of the world. Jesus was a fulfillment of past prophecies. Jesus wasn't new, he was old. And the Quran, too, never claims to be bringing new information. The one God has been sending prophets with revealed messages and scriptures since the dawn of time. Muhammad and his Quran weren't some novelty in world history. They were just a reminder of people and revelations that had happened many times over in the past. Even the modern word religion works this way. Remember how the word is from the Latin religio, something done over and over again in a ritualized way? The very word religion suggests doing something that's been done before. It is explicitly not about new things. When you perform a ritual, you are doing something yet again. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when new religions appear, they usually don't explain themselves as new religions. They're just the same old religions of the olden days brought back to life again. Martin Luther claimed that his theology was just the same old theology of the Gospel of John and the Epistles of Paul. Orthodox Jews say that they read the Torah just as their ancestors did. Modern Theravada Buddhists claim to follow the tradition of the elders, going all the way back to the Buddha himself, or even further if you account for the Buddha's former lives. Give me that old-time religion, as the American Protestant hymn declares again and again and again. But why do religions like to defer to the past? Why not just say when they're being new? Or why not defer to the future? To a certain extent, they do, of course. Religious ethics are really about the present, things that happen here and now. And eschatology is all about what will happen one day in the future. But still, why don't religions ever just call themselves new? Well, maybe there's value to tradition itself. While there's nothing wrong with questioning traditional thoughts and practices per se, you have to admit that even people who claim to be non-religious will default to more traditional activities and rituals for most of the important occasions in their lives. If you graduate from college, your clothes immediately return to the 16th century. Often when an otherwise secular woman gets married, she wears a veil that is positively medieval. If you have a baby, you're very likely to name it after someone who's long dead. And when you die, you either get buried in the Jewish, Christian, or Islamic fashion which prepares your body for the future resurrection from the dead, or you get cremated in the Hindu, Buddhist, or pagan fashion. There are other clothes you could possibly wear to a wedding or to your graduation, and you could name your baby whatever you want. And there are plenty of other ways to dispose of bodies besides cremation and burial. So, why do even non-religious people quickly jump back to the old ways that refer to old belief systems and customs that they might not even adhere to anymore? And then there's also the biggest religious turn to the past of all, one that even modern atheists seem fine with. That time itself refers to the past. Every single religion that we've covered in this course has a calendar system. Some follow the movements of the moon, like the Jewish and Islamic calendars. Some follow the movements of the sun, like the Christian Gregorian calendar that we use today in the West. And some use both the movements of the sun and the moon together, like most Hindu, Buddhist, and Chinese calendars do. Even the atheists of the cult of reason following the French Revolution had a short-lived metric calendar of 10-day weeks. But what do all these calendars have in common? No matter how they divide up days, weeks, months, and years, they all repeat themselves. It's Easter again. It's summer again. It's Hajj again. It's Sabbath again. It's Friday again. It's morning again. It's your birthday again. History folds back on itself in a way that makes no rational sense. Having time repeat itself doesn't help us do anything or figure anything out or provide us with new information. But all cultures and all religions do this. So again, what's up with this reliving of the past? Maybe the answer to all this fixation with old things, isn't rational. Maybe it's more like mysticism. If you participate in a ritual, you are reenacting something, doing something a second, or 10th, or millionth time. And like Aristotle tells us, participating in a cultic rite isn't about new learning. It's about experience. It gives you a kind of understanding without giving you new data. Why does tradition make a difference? So much so that every civilization on Earth has ordered history itself so that calendars repeat infinitely. Well, no reason. It just works for us in some non-rational way. Like the cycles of seasons or days, there's something in people that wants to go around again. So, in practice, we defer to ancient people and try to do what the ancients did. It's as if the ancients figured something out. We can't say for sure what it is that they figured out, but it's something. So now, let's take a look at yet another new religion, neo or new paganism. And like other new religions we've met, in fact, like all the religions that we've met, it talks about itself not as novelty, but as a return to a forgotten past. Part 2. Paganism. Again? It's particularly tricky to define or catalog the phenomena referred to as neo-paganism. First, like the ancient collection of practices, beliefs, rituals, and cultures of old paganism, neo-paganism has no real founder, no common orthodoxy, no standard orthopraxy, and no global institutions. But unlike ancient paganisms, neo-paganism has no political authority and few formal centers of worship. And yet, neo-paganism is one of the fastest growing religions in the Western world, even though its radical disorganization means it's impossible to say how many of these neo-pagans there actually are. If you want to look at neo-paganism historically, it's mostly postmodern. Most neo-pagans would be very uncomfortable with meta-narratives, any claim that their personal religious stances have public dimensions or are true outside of their personal contexts. But if there is a common narrative of neo-paganism, it springs from some kind of limited rejection of Western modernity and institutional Christianity. To get around modernity's and modern Christianity's supposed shortcomings, neo-pagans turn to a pre-modern and especially pre-Christian form of ritual, belief, custom, and mythology. Like all religious movements that claim to be restoring an ancient lost past, we can ask how much of this is actually happening with neo-paganism. How much is actually ancient and how much is actually new? Neo-paganism, like all the religions we've met here, is a product of certain historical forces that only make sense in particular settings, not others. So while we can find the roots of neo-paganism in the original paganisms of the ancient world, we can find its roots just as much in a number of 19th and 20th century arguments against modernity, which of course would be entirely foreign to ancient pagans. In the 19th century, there were many groups and individuals who, mostly independent of each other, tried to restore something of the pre-modern world after the apparent failures of modernity. So, for example, we see in 19th century England and Germany the appearance of Romanticism. Romanticism is a number of different artistic and literary trends which saw modernity as unhealthy and dehumanizing. A classic example that's still famous today would be Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. The major themes of this novel are the dangers of modernity, ignoring divine and natural law in the name of scientific progress. Shelley's novel, like Romanticism generally, argued that there was something very, very wrong with how the modern mind disregarded the sacredness of nature. Also in the 19th century, we see a rising interest in occultism. Occultism, from the Latin word meaning hidden, is the modern turn to non-scientific beliefs in the supernatural. Flying in the face of the Enlightenment, many moderns in the 19th century looked for defiantly non-empirical forms of knowledge. Astrology, the claim that the heavenly bodies directly affect human lives. Fortune-telling, like tarot card reading, and the belief in psychics. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, the argument that there are non-quantifiable senses available to the human mind. And seances, attempts to make contact with spirits, or dead people. These all became mainstream after the rise of modernity, and specifically after modern science. While many people may laugh at such practices and beliefs as irrational, silly, or quackery, their very existence tells us that a lot of people were, and many still are, deeply discontented with science as the sole means of correctly attaining knowledge. Breakthroughs in modern anthropology and archaeology also provided many people with doubts about the cultural superiority of the modern Western world. New information about Egyptian, Indian, and pre-European American cultures, like the Maya and the Incas, by professional academics, led some amateur researchers to conclude that these ancient peoples had access to forms of knowledge unknown to modern Europeans and Americans. There was a popular turn to interpret the new findings of the social sciences through occultism. Claims that, for instance, the pyramids of the Giza Plateau or the line arts of the Nazca people in Peru were evidence of supernatural powers or non-scientific wisdom that was somehow lost in the modern age. Again, the social scientists who were performing this ethnographic and archaeological research on the ground generally rejected claims about supposedly forgotten occult knowledge. But the fact that many non-religious people wanted to look at history as full of supernatural, non-scientific technologies and forms of knowledge should tip us off that modernity maybe lacked something for a large number of people. Neo-paganism proper appeared on the scene, pulling inspiration from all these kinds of doubts about modernity. The principal player here was a man named Gerald Gardner. Throughout his life, Gardner had dabbled in occultism and amateur anthropology. In 1939, Gardner claims that he was initiated into a secret coven, or a community of practitioners, of what he called the old religion. Gardner said that a small group of people had continued practicing the pre-Christian religions of Britain and Ireland in private homes and remote wildernesses. And specifically, that they were still worshipping a great goddess whose cult the Christians had long ago tried to suppress. But, according to Gardner, a few goddess worshippers had defied the odds and over the course of centuries had held on to these more ancient religions in secret. Later, Gardner would identify this old religion as Wicca, from the Old English literally meaning wisdom or a wise person, but it was used idiomatically for someone who practices magic, hence it's the root of our modern English word, witch. And many Wiccans may also identify themselves as witches or practitioners of witchcraft. The story goes that in early medieval England, the word Wicca was used to explain a local wise person, like a healer. Someone, especially a woman, who knew how to use plants, minerals, and foods as medicine, and how these items could also be used in worship and ritual. When the Christians arrived, they dismissed many of these practices as pagan nonsense. Remember that the word pagan was originally used as an insult. And hence, there was a Christian association between the demonic, or at least anti-Christian practices of these witches. This is also why the word witch and practices that come out of pre-Christian Britain are often associated with curses, nonsensical hocus pocus, and overt Satan worship. Modern Wiccans, who started to appear in the 1950s and 60s, denied the association between their practice and evil, and therefore often would turn to words like neo-paganism and Wicca, which didn't carry the same connotations as pagan, witch, or witchcraft. Although many do try to reclaim the word witch from these negative implications, they strongly deny that witches worship the demonic, and usually will claim that devils don't even exist. Although Gerald Gardner got the ball rolling for neo-paganism, other expressions of neo-paganism appeared that weren't strongly affected by his personal beliefs or thoughts. Many would use this label Wicca, which he popularized, especially in England and the United States, but most did not. Neither Gardner nor anyone else defined the neo-pagan movement, but he's probably the first person to clearly, directly frame his religious thoughts as neo-paganism. Part 3. The Neo-Pagan Free-for-All. While there are many neo-pagan authors, including Gerald Gardner, whose works are functionally classics of neo-pagan communities around the world, there's nothing approaching what we might call a scripture. In fact, if we're pressed to find some kind of common literature of neo-paganism, it's the practice of creating grimoires, a personal spiritual diary or journal, also referred to as a book of shadows. The contents of these grimoires are hardly standardized, and naturally they only reflect the personal thoughts, poetry, artwork, and beliefs of the given author. And like this personal version of scripture, if we can even call it that, there is no shared worldview or creed of all neo-pagans. They may be monotheists, polytheists, atheists, or indeterminately spiritual. And they may freely switch between these categories as need demands at the moment, speaking of God in the singular when addressing, let's say, the unity of nature, speaking of plural gods when addressing the diversity of people or the diversity of natural phenomena, and so on. But, as even with the most decentralized religions, there are some rough patterns in neo-pagan theology. Neo-pagans are almost always invested in a return to nature in some form. The logic goes that Western culture, both institutional Christianity and scientific culture, decoupled people from the natural world. Humans, they would argue, were once more religiously affected by natural forces, animals, and plants, much more than they are now. Institutional Christianity and modern science have both disregarded the significance of the natural environment to human well-being. While few neo-pagans would declare themselves to be anti-science or even anti-Christian, most would critique science and Christianity for overlooking or suppressing the importance of nature. Christianity, at least in its organized churches, the neo-pagan might claim, treated the natural world as broken, or at least as spiritually insignificant to Christian thought and practice. And the neo-pagan might argue that science objectifies the natural environment, treating the earth, plants, and animals as mere tools for humans to use as they please. So neo-paganism presents itself as a corrective by turning to those religions which treated natural phenomena as divine forces, objects of love and fear and worship. That is, ancient paganism. Usually in neo-paganism, there's much more priority given to feminine or female expressions of God. So ancient pagan goddesses like Venus, Diana, Isis, and Ostara appear somewhat more often than their male counterparts. Or hybrid goddesses composed of the features of many ancient divinities might appear. Or more generic goddess figures might be invoked, standing in for any, all, or no one particular goddess. A very common image of the goddess in neo-pagan groups is the so-called triple goddess, who appears variously as a young maiden, a middle-aged mother, and a crone, an old woman. This symbolizes the life cycle from childhood to old age, or vitality, the maiden, creativity, the mother, and wisdom, the crone. What exactly these goddesses all mean, and why goddesses are featured much more commonly than gods, is up to the individual. A neo-pagan could claim that the divine is actually beyond gender, but that somehow the feminine more accurately reflects God than the masculine. Or that any gender could be correctly applied to the divine, but the feminine is to be prioritized to counteract centuries of male depictions of the deity, especially those of Christianity. Or other neo-pagans may take a polytheistic approach and claim that these goddesses coexist alongside traditional male gods like Zeus or Horus or Odin, but just that a particular practitioner can choose to prefer the goddesses over the gods. Or, following the ancient pagan pattern of associating the feminine with the earth, and the masculine with the heavens, a neo-pagan might highlight earth goddesses, like goddesses of fertility or the home, as these are more significant to human experiences today than sky and storm gods are. Or yet again, the neo-pagan could be an atheist, and these goddesses are simply a projection of the given neo-pagan's imagination. So one's simply choosing to imagine the forces of nature in the natural world as feminine. Another common feature of neo-paganism is a rejection of dogmatism or orthodoxy, with the exception of actions or beliefs that directly harm or oppress other people. Most neo-pagans would say that you are morally free to do whatever you'd like, as long as your actions do not stop others from exercising their own freedom to do as they would like. There's a common expression in many Wiccan circles called the Wiccan Rede, from the Middle English word for advice. This rede has many different formulations, but all are comparable to the phrase, "Do as you will, but harm none." Following from this, generally, but not as a rule, neo-pagans often speak of universal laws of balance and reciprocity. Not unrelated to the modern Western misreading of karma as what goes around comes around, neo-pagans will commonly speak of natural forces of cause and effect in highly personal ways. Roughly, what you put out into the world, you'll somehow receive back. There is some unspecified justice built into the world, in which actions, good or bad, will be repaid to the actor in kind. Usually, this recompense is implied to occur in this lifetime, as neo-paganism is very often, but not always, disinterested in eschatology. This leads to neo-paganism's most commonly attested belief, in the existence, in some form or another, of magic, the ability of humans to somehow create change in the world or in themselves by means of indirect influence. Most neo-pagan magic is situational. Say a given family member is sick, or a student wants to do well on an upcoming final exam. By calling down or invoking a deity, a neo-pagan hopes to manipulate events to a positive outcome. This can be very simple or very complex. At the most basic level, say the given neo-pagan wanted to get rid of a bad habit. She could just write down the name of this habit on a piece of paper and then burn that paper over a candle. Much more complicated magical performances might involve many neo-pagans acting together as a coven, with one or more serving as a priestess or priest. A circle is drawn, meaning a ritual space is declared ready for ritual use, and words, rites, movements, or songs are performed communally. While, as always, not all neo-pagans would claim to believe in magic, most would. But yet again, what magic means is debatable. Generally, most neo-pagan magic is simply cultic ritual. That is, a ceremony is performed, often in a natural setting, that is supposed to prompt change within the individual. So it's magic, but only in the sense of creating internal, spiritual transformation. Or, neo-pagan magic might be the practice of some kind of non-modern medicines, actions, foods, or words that are supposed to fix something wrong inside of one's body or mind. Or, a neo-pagan might believe that magic can create actual external changes in nature or people directly, but that it works through purely material principles, just principles that modern science cannot or has not yet discovered. So in this case, magic just means science that's not known to any scientist. Or, a neo-pagan might not believe in magic in any literal sense of the term, but practice magical rituals for their own sake, like mystical experiences. Many neo-pagans also follow liturgical calendars to mark holidays. See, everybody's got to have a calendar. Here, for instance, is a common version of the Wiccan calendar, composed of a combination of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon festivals. The year is divided into 4 seasons by the equinoxes and the solstices, called the quarter days, with each season marked with a cross-quarter day, the middle day of each season. Each of these quarter and cross-quarter days marks a festival, or Sabbat, using the anglicized version of the Hebrew Shabbat, or Sabbath. Some neo-pagans also practice their rituals following the lunar cycles, with the days of the full and new moons being especially significant. How these Sabbats, full moons, and new moons are celebrated is either personal or regional. Some are just an excuse for a party. Others are elaborate affairs with processions, robes, symbolic gestures, songs, and dances. Something common in nearly all neo-pagan rituals, but again, not as a rule, are so-called Discordian behaviors. That is, random, usually silly elements will be purposefully introduced to an otherwise serious ritual. There's something very tongue-in-cheek about many neo-paganisms, either because they don't take their religious practices as literally true, so there's no problem with having a little bit of fun in it, or just because the given neo-pagan doesn't think that she should take herself too seriously. Or again, as a way of counteracting Christianity and other institutional religions, which are often accused of being humorless or stuffy. Or these Discordian behaviors might be seen as a kind of balancing principle. The gravity of a ritual or celebration has to be symbolically counterbalanced with a dash of merriment. Some questions to discuss in class. What are some ways that religions present themselves as a return to the past? Where does neo-paganism appear in history, and what's it responding to? What are some common features of neo-pagan thought and practice?